Arcane League of Legends is a bad TV show. Yeah, anybody who's seen a single episode can tell you that what I just said is nonsense of the highest order. Thing is though, you take an honest look at it on paper and logically, it should be, because it's basic beyond imagination. Take a second to think about it. You got a streetwise fighter who punches first and asks questions later, a world split between a glamorous utopia and an urban pit of despair, a criminal mastermind moving things along from the shadows and a loose cannon who works for him, a failed revolution widening the gap between the have and have-nots, well-meaning scientists playing with forces they can't possibly understand, many bitter fallings out between best friends. I could go on, but you've got the picture, yeah? By all accounts, it should suck. It should be really, really bad. But it isn't. Why? You could waste hours trying to pick it apart, but there's no need to. The answer is a lot less complex than you're likely thinking. You see, when a working draft of a script is filled with tropes and archetypes, writers will generally do one of three things. A. Let it go right over their heads. B. Panic and become so preoccupied trying to get around these, subvert them you might even say, that it becomes bloated and even more cliche. Or C. Throw their hands up and roll with it. Very few people realize how much power is in Option C, but it can be put to good use and might even change the way you view storytelling. Today I'm going to explain how valuable that tactic can be if it's applied appropriately using the love of my life, Arcane, as an example. Buckle up, dear viewer, because this is going to get detailed. First and foremost, we need to talk about tropes. What are they and why are they bad? Well, they're not. Not inherently, at least. A trope is a popular convention in a story or genre. And that's it. It's just something that is repeated across enough stories enough times that any Joe off the street can pick it out on sight. Most of the time in common language, it relates to a character or a piece of narrative context such as background history. The danger in using tropes, as in all things with writing, is overdosing. But at the end of the day, a trope is just another tool in the writer's arsenal. Brush versus the artist and all that. The reason that tropes specifically have become such a big deal in the public consciousness is that they are highly noticeable just by virtue of being used frequently enough to be dubbed tropes in the first place, making both writers and audiences a bit sensitive to their presence. Another word you'll hear tossed around like a rival school's mascot when the varsity team is at your door and ready to beat up you and your friends unless you hightail it out the window and leave your friend holding the bag is archetype. While it might sound more professional and therefore more intimidating than trope, it's pretty similar in meaning. An archetype might be defined as a very typical example of a person or thing. In narrative terms, this means that some element of a story, usually a character, follows a commonly treaded path of progression. For instance, the evident nobody fated for a big heroic destiny is one of the most famous and recognizable tropes in all of fiction, being seen in such characters as archetypes are a fairly specific subset of tropes, but not all tropes are automatically archetypes. Squares and rectangles, if you will. Basically, archetypes are popular building blocks for a story, whereas tropes are generally more connected with specific mechanisms of propelling said story forward. The aforementioned zero to hero can theoretically be discovered in any manner, but you'll commonly see a character who will eventually become a mentor approach them after realizing that they have special powers, even more often than not after the newbie accidentally taps into them for the first time. That's a trope connected to the destined hero archetype. There is nothing new under the sun, and there haven't been any quote-unquote original concepts for millennia. Storytellers have been reliant on tropes for as long as we've had the concept. When something comes along that we identify as creative, it's because the people behind it have taken something commonplace and put a unique spin on it. Take Lord of the Rings, for example. Frodo is the small-town nobody who gets pulled into a divine quest to destroy the ultimate MacGuffin for the majority of the tale. Near the end, however, we see him pass up the chance to destroy Satan's mood ring once and for all, and it's only chance that Gollum falls into the fires of Mount Doom with the One Ring in hand after prying it from Frodo's clutches. Unlike the many prior legends of the hero destroying evil and saving the day, the hero fails and evil folds in on itself. That's clever. That's one of a million reasons why Tolkien is still rightly revered as the GOAT 3/4 of a century later. With all that in mind, we can finally get to talking about Arcane. Practically everything in the setup is a trope or an archetype of some sort that's been played out 100 times before. Surely there's nothing new that could be said with them, right? Incorrect. That kind of thinking demonstrates a lack of will and so a lack of way. I'm of the ironclad opinion that if you're committed to doing something, then you'll find a way to do it well, and this is definitely true of writing. I mean, it's the job of writers to push the bounds of creativity. So, how can you do that with distinctly uncreative elements? As I said before, the best thing you can do when approaching a trope is to lean into it once you've decided to use it. This doesn't mean walk in the exact same steps of your predecessor, but rather look at them and choose which ones to follow and where to veer off into your own path. Let's just start by looking at the series concept. The pitch spelled out in the show's IMDb blurb goes, amid the stark discord of Twin Cities Piltover and Zon, two sisters fight on rival sides of a war between magic technologies and clashing convictions.
Oh, brother, this guy stinks!
Yeah, that's not helpful. A better way to put that would be, a young woman struggles to reunite with her estranged sister while navigating through a Piltover ready to go to war with itself as new tech widens the gap between the well-off topside and the squalid undercity, and a crime lord with dreams of revolution draws the day of reckoning ever closer. Oh, expert you cantankerous critic, why is that better, I hear you ask? Well, because it highlights more of what we're dealing with here. The concept of a lower class being repressed by ignorant and/or evil overlords is nothing special. However, having both sides think that they're doing what they can to help the floundering oppressed, that's not as common, and it's fertile ground to farm. Much of the show's meat and potatoes comes from comparing and contrasting how Piltover's council and the founders of Hextech go about doing that versus how the Lanes and the dominant forces therein do. It's also popular for these types of stories to have some kind of underground society that sustains the lower class more or less with the knowledge of the upper crust. But again, Arcane's writers found a new twist in the form of asking, what if the dominant force in the Undercity wasn't automatically good just because it's in the lower half? Enter Silco and his shimmering. But all that's just background noise. When you get right down to it, the heart of the story is the dynamic between Vi and Jinx, and all else should either flow from that, support it, or challenge it in some way. I'd argue that the golden rule of this show is that the two sisters cannot coexist in peace. In the first season, it gives the story life. In the second season, it's nowhere near as good, but you can always trace something by the hole it leaves, and looking at the tail of a coin can help to identify it just the same as looking at the head. This was a good call. You get invested in people, not events. While it might be fun to map out all the big battles and stuff, none of it works if your audience isn't invested in the people who live in the world. By centering what could have been a grand-scale epic about magic and revolution on the smaller scope of two sisters, the writers got to zoom in and show how this stuff functions at a personal level as opposed to the large-scale, on-paper results that you'd see from other similar stories or if you were, say, on the city's council. Of course, it eventually became a grand-scale epic about magic and forgetting the revolution, but that's a topic for another day. You might have noticed that one character tracks another, specifically a long-lost loved one, is in itself a big fat setup trope. Normally in such stories, you'd have the protagonist gradually discover and get sucked into a world previously unknown to them. Think Supernatural here. Arcane's decision to play this trope out in the context of the magical powerful stuff being common knowledge allowed it to skip past all the discovery crap and get right into the weeds of navigating the characters and their relationships with one another and the world around them. It also adds to the audience's sense of this is the way things are for the characters, the natural state of affairs, the status quo. And so, dear viewer, we see the first trick to using archetypes and tropes effectively. Combine several at once, especially if they're not usually paired together. This lets you check out new creative directions that feel fresh, even if in the grand scheme of things they aren't. Just look at how much came from the decision to layer the cat and mouse trope over the elite versus commoners trope. Before jumping into my next section, I want to highlight one more instance of clever trope usage that doesn't neatly fit into any other segment. This, I admit, is not my point to make, but something I got from a Master Samwise video I have linked in the description. Please check it out, it's very good. The first 3 episodes of the show set us up with a close-knit crew of lovable, flawed kids from the Undercity that we expect to follow for the show's duration as they grow as individuals and as a collective, going on adventures and improving the world around them as they do. The end of Act 1, however, pulls the rug from under the feet of characters and audiences alike with 10 of the most heartbreaking minutes of television I've ever watched, setting the stage for what the rest of the show will actually be about. It works because by the end of the 3rd episode, you've taken the time to really connect with the characters as they are, so you feel the weight of the tragedy that befalls them and you understand where they're coming from when we pick up with them some years down the line. So we've seen a few examples of how tropes in world building and plot concepts can be used to good effect. Now I want to examine how they work in other facets of the story, starting with one I've already referenced several times so far. Alright, come on, you know I have to. It's time to talk about the characters. I could literally gush about every last one for hours, but for the sake of brevity, I'll stick with what I would define as the core 4. Vi, Jinx, Silco, and Vander. Given that they fill the main roles, it might make sense to talk about Vi and Jinx first. But I think we can get more out of that process if we know the mindsets of their biggest influences and how that played into the way the kids were respectively raised. So I'll start with the old guard. Silco is my favorite character in the show. But he's also the walking, talking archetype of a criminal mastermind with the world in his pocket and class to boot. He's even got a fake eye for crying out loud. I mean, seriously! It would have been perilously easy for him to become awkward and formulaic, but thankfully that's not what we wound up with. Silco is the kingpin of the Undercity, true. He's also desperate to lead Zon to independence. He's also a loving, if unhealthy, father figure for Jinx. These are 3 distinct motivations that he views as being equally compatible. When you look at the story, however, you can see that they frequently butt heads against one another, forcing him to decide what's important to him and causing ripple after ripple. Rather than try to retcon his history and personality to make him more quote-unquote original, the writers took his foundation and built on it by giving him conflicting motivations. Let me give you an example. His whole life has been about spearheading the effort to make Zon an independent nation at any cost. This is what led him to build his Shimmer Empire to begin with, and at first glance it looks like things are going according to plan and he really does have his sights on target. However, his commitment to the cause is called into question multiple times after he adopts and looks after Jinx, who is objectively bad for it. He eventually meets with Jace and is offered a chance to get Zon's sovereignty, but it will come at the cost of handing over his daughter. This leads him to vent his frustrations to Vander's statue, meaning Jinx overheard him and figured he would do it, causing her to kidnap him for the tea party, and we all know how that went. Now, with the benefit of a little perspective, we find that Silco by himself is not all that tropey. Sure, he inhabits the physical characteristics you'd expect from somebody like him, right down to the way Jason Spizak delivers his lines. Yet there is more than meets the eye when it comes to this wannabe revolutionary gang lord who ultimately chooses to be a father in whatever ill-fated capacity he knows how. But what about Vander? With him we get the picture of a man who used to feel strongly about freeing the Undercity even if it meant getting his hands dirty, but who became exhausted with the destruction and settled into the role of peacekeeper between the two factions. He even keeps his battle gauntlets hung in a prominent position in the Last Drop, the bar he owns and operates, to remind him of what he stands for. Furthermore, knowing what we do about him, we might infer that the idea behind a bar being his establishment of choice is to create common space for camaraderie. His first scene where he bails Huck out from some unpleasant dealings tells you all you need to know about the guy. His attitude is best seen in the way he raises all his kids, but especially Vi. I'll talk more about her in a minute, but for Vander's part, he finds more of himself in her than he would like to. 9 out of 10 cases where you find the old school parental figure trope, that character is encouraging the members of the new school to pick up the torch for the cause of the righteous, to strike at the heart of evil and save the day. Vander raises the question, what's the point if there's nothing left to save after the dust settles? In his mind, the cost of getting Zon to the point of independence is too great to pay, but he sees that Vi doesn't feel the same way. He wants to do what he can to prevent her from walking the same path he once did when he was younger and full of idealism. That's the first lure of Vander, but I'm peeling it away to examine the next one down. Sort of. I'm actually doubling back to the chunk about preaching to the younger generation. Whether the old-timer is telling the hero to take up arms, or to never give up, or to do whatever, they are always correct. Experience is the best teacher, right? In the words of the Iron Chancellor, fools learn from experience. I prefer to learn from the experience of others. Vander thinks he has this down pat. He wants Vi to learn from his experience before she lands herself and her siblings in some serious trouble. What he fails to realize, however, is that he's not 100% on the level either. He has now become a pacifist to the point of inaction. Don't get it twisted, I love it when mature characters are allowed to impart good teachings to their youthful counterparts. But it has to be good teachings. Vander's point about not instigating trouble only stretches so far before it, like immediate aggression, becomes a point of flaw. Most surrogate parental figures in fiction serve to give the hero motivation in life and in memory. The aim of Vander's involvement was to give Vi something to wrestle with. It's a clever little piece of writing that you wouldn't have predicted going in. Now we get to the dysfunctional dyad of Vi and Jinx. Vi first. In the barest of terms, you only need one word to describe Vi. Fighter. She thinks with her fists, and good luck to anybody who tries to hold her back from reaching her goal. Fighters tend to be one-note characters who fit into a sidekick role and supply the comic relief. Vi, being Vi, is nobody's sidekick, and suggesting her as comic relief is like saying that about Batman. Putting a fighter into a main character role was a bold choice, to be sure. Because of that, Vi has to be a little more complex than hitting her way through the narrative. At first, her one and only purpose seems to be reuniting with Jinx, and she's doing fine with the whole punchy-punchy thing to get it done. Look a little closer, however, and you'll find that this isn't the case. What she really wants is to reunite with Powder, who for all intents and purposes doesn't exist.
Powder fell down a well.
When she does come face to face with Jinx for the first time in years, her task becomes separating the image in her head from the girl in front of her and to figure out whether she can accept her sister as is. Facing her with an obstacle she can't Vi her way out of allows us to see the layers of her previously closed-off pathos. It is at this point that I assume the writers, not happy with making us witness this trauma alone, ask themselves, how can we make this more interesting? And so, like Silco, they gave Vi some conflicting motivations. From the days of the failed revolution, Vi has been imbued with a strong sense of justice and a desire to do good for her fellow Zonites. This comes into direct contrast with what she deems to be the good of her sister when she finds out what Jinx has been up to during the time she was in Stillwater Prison, forcing her to look within and make some hard decisions. This is where Vander's philosophy comes back into play and mixes with Vi's rather unfortunate wanting to have it all mentality, causing her to decide that it's best for both Jinx and the city if she takes the two of them out of play altogether. By the time of the tea party, she's made the decision to make Jinx her priority and offers to run away with her if she's willing to step out of the Jinx life. Once again, that's partially due to Vi, like Silco, having a third motive that challenges everything she thought she knew and held dear. Okay, here's where I run a statement across the screen that I encourage you to pause and read. Are you ready? 3, 2, 1. With that being said, there is the clear and obvious affection that Vi has for Caitlyn, a wealthy topside native enforcer who, in theory, is everything she detests. Upon being made to spend serious lengths of time together, however, the two of them experience a strong back and forth dialogue that leads both to shift their stances about the other side in small increments at a time. By giving Vi multiple ideals that need reconciling, the writers took a potentially flat character and made her a nuanced individual that we were glad to follow over the course of the show. I would like to amend my earlier statement that there are no bad tropes. In my mind, there is at least one, which is the manic pixie trope. This is the flighty, certifiably bonkers girl who is easily manipulated by anyone and everyone as long as she has the chance to cause some chaos and have fun. My problem with this is twofold. First, most stories don't bother to address this behavior, which implies that it's an okay way to be and or it doesn't require additional exploration because that would reveal it to be problematic. Second, it gives this character precisely zero agency, room to grow, or really ability to do much of anything besides shoot wherever she's aimed. It's an asinine premise, and blessedly is not what we get with Jinx. Yes, that does describe her to a T, so what's different this time? Simple. The story acknowledges it. Through the lens of different characters, we get to see those around Jinx come to understand why she is the way she is without excusing her actions. Also, a good number of scenes are dedicated to showing how her experiences negatively impact her well-being, which shows how the writers took both this character and the subject matter seriously. Nice going, guys! All you have to do now is not completely throw her hallucinations and paranoia out the window in the second season. The way the writers told Jinx's story gets around three major fallacies that such characters often fall into. Most obviously is the childhood trauma thing that people like to lean on like Tiny Tim on a crutch, because apart from Jason Heimerdinger, everybody in this show has heaps of it and mostly turned out to be decent human beings. Second comes the tool for greater powers explanation that says she was only doing bad things because Silco told her to, which is true, but only until he dies. Everything after that is 100% no holds barred on her. And yes, that includes the... Even so, she is not absolved. The rest of the world is bent on bringing her to justice to answer for her actions. Springing from that is the final issue of they don't know what they're doing, where their mind is so screwed up that they can't tell right from wrong. Jinx has a sense of morality. She must, because otherwise she wouldn't be able to experience the guilt that is a core aspect of her character. This is what makes her repeated decisions to stay with the unhealthy patterns that much harder to witness. Naturally, we circle back to the question of why does she experience guilt in the first place? Because, dear viewer, this is Arcane, and they're not going to let one of the main characters float on by without layered character building, a logical backstory, and copious emotional damage. I could eat up another few minutes parsing all that out, but if you've made it this far, then you're familiar with the show, and I don't want to camp on it too long because what's in her motivations is not the takeaway. Merely that it exists is enough to prove the gist of what I'm saying. That's all good and well for each of those characters. Well, it's not very good for them, but it's good for us. Now we must ask what all four of them have in common. I'll give you a hint, it's a 10-letter word beginning with S that I have ranted about several times on this channel before. That's right, the word of the moment is subversion. Despite how it may appear, I'm not against subversion of expectations on principle, I'm just against it being done poorly as seems to occur so unhappily often nowadays. I'm of the mind that the problem can best be summed up with the phrase trope but. Superman, but he's no longer a paragon of virtue and is instead a cynical, depressed loner. See how ridiculous that is? It's trickery simply for the sake of self-importance. Say what you will about Gunn Superman, but at least he understood that much. Subversion of audience expectations should be included to enrich the story by taking it in a fitting direction that only the most astute viewers would have picked up on. Therefore, the second method of adequately using tropes would be to consider trope and logic. Arcane understands this. It gives us smooth-talking criminal ringleader, and he's doing it for the quote-unquote right reasons. Fighter and caring devoted sister. Good-hearted adoptive parental figure, and philosophically mistaken. Manic pixie, and it's finally taken seriously. Whew, done with that section. If you're not sold on either of the methods I've outlined so far, don't lose hope yet. Believe it or not, there's actually a third way to use tropes, and it's so stupid that it goes right back around full circle to being genius, because some things are so obvious that not a person in the world can spot it unless they're taught to. Roll with it. Treat it like a non-object, act like it doesn't exist, let it be what it is, and move on. You maneuver around the issue of the trope by doing nothing with it. Admittedly, this is the hardest of the three to get right, and the consequences of getting it wrong are not fun. But take heart. Once you've set up the majority of your story in a way that doesn't feel like it's been trot out 1,000 times, you earn the space for things like this, and the space to experiment a bit. Consider Savika and Heimerdinger. Expert you enlightener of excellent entertainment, you said you were done talking about the characters. Oh yeah, guess I did. I meant to say that I was finished with the deep dives. I promised to keep it light here. Jaime is the revered little guy who is hundreds of years old and speaks in well-intentioned but slowly decaying wisdom. And that's kinda it for him. The writers even play it up at times, particularly in the second season. The clever bit is that because this is the normal setting for him, it gives more weight to the moments where he goes from Fuzzy Yoda to I have seen terrors beyond mortal comprehension. That is, to audiences who have the full picture. It's much harder to pick things out as a character with a limited knowledge scope. Furthermore, it is unreasonable to assume a character knows what genre they're in. Jace probably thought he was in a rom-com, for instance, so there was no reason for the council to take Heimerdinger's doom and gloom at face value when 99% of the time he acts like the town grandpa. It isn't until the other boot drops that they begin to take him seriously, by which point the gloves are off and I run out of clothing-based colloquialisms. Savika, on the other hand, presents a problem to a writer. She's a minor side character, so you don't want to give her too much attention, but you also want her to be up to par with the rest of your phenomenal cast. So, what do you do when you have a basic henchwoman? The answer, of course, is to leave her as a basic henchwoman and work within those confines. This will allow you to do fun stuff like make her competent at her job and give her logical motivations for her actions, thus ensuring that she adds value to the story without detracting from the main narrative. The subplot of Finn's takeover comprises only 3 scenes, 2 of which heavily feature Savika, and the one where he tries to sway her to his side takes only a minute and a half. That is not a lot of screen time. But across these few scenes, Savika, and for that fact Finn as well, have so much presence that it feels like a lot more. That's pretty much all I have to say by way of this method. I mean, let's be honest, it doesn't require a lot of expounding, and anything else I could add onto it is just tacking irreplaceable seconds onto a video that already weighs in at north of 20 minutes. Using the trio of tactics I've outlined today, Arcane got out of its own way to become something truly incredible. Contrary to what you might think after all this, I stand by the statements I made at the start of this video about how tropey it sounds when you're describing it, reason being that for all intents and purposes, it is. It is really tropey, it's just not a bad thing in this context. The difference between Arcane and the myriad of riffraff that never quite rises to the same heights is the writer's ability to work with the tropes instead of trying to work against them. Because really, when it comes to writing, anything can be used to good effect so long as you know what you're doing. It doesn't matter how basic your story is, or how many times similar ones have been told before, or even how clever you might be for getting around the most common ways of telling it. It's all down to the execution. If a series based around a game that's about as complex as hit the other team's tower until it breaks could do it, well, there's hope for anybody. Point of all this being, Joseph Campbell would have either really loved or really hated this show.